Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groos, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Anna Kornbluh in today's episode. She is a professor at the English department of the University of Illinois, Chicago, and author of several books, the latest of which is titled Immediacy, or The Style of Too Late Capitalism. Before we start, I have a couple of announcements to make. First of all, on the release date of this very episode, on August 3rd, 2025, there will be a Future Histories live recording with the great Louise Meyer in Hamburg in cooperation with the Zollo Collective. So if this episode is coming out and you're in or around Hamburg, come and join us. This is a continuation of the absolutely fantastic yearly Future Histories live events at Zollo, which I very much enjoy, I have to say. In the previous years, I was happy to welcome Eva von Redeker, Katharina Hoppe, Bini Adamczak, and now Louise Meyer. I'm very much looking forward to this. August 3rd, Bullerdeich 6 in Hamburg at 6 o'clock. Looking forward to seeing you there. On the very next day, August 4th, I'll be a guest at La Banda Varga in Freiburg to deliver a short input and then discuss questions of democratic planning and creative construction. We'll start at 8 p.m. Again, very much looking forward to see you there. And from Freiburg, I'll head straight to the Rethinking Economics Summer School in the Swiss Alps, where there will be another Future Histories live event, this time with the always great Rabia Befelde. You'll find links to all of the three events in the show notes. I'm really looking forward to it, and hopefully we'll see each other at one of these events. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Anna Kornbluh on climate counter-aesthetics. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Anna, I wrote you because in one of your public talks, you teased an upcoming book project on climate counter-aesthetics, a topic that I'm interested in for various reasons. What is it that you plan to explore under this heading of climate counter-aesthetics?
Oh, sure. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I've been working on this for a little while, and I want to explore, as maybe the title suggests, although it doesn't telegraph, aesthetic forms that are helpful for thinking through climate problems and climate solutions, but that do so in a different way than we usually presume. So that's the counterpart, right? That they're sort of like against the dominant ideas of how art might be useful at this moment or how art might be instructive at this moment. So that's the kind of broader frame for it.
What would be the dominant form that we think art might be useful in these cases?
So that's the part that I find really unsatisfying. There are a number of answers in this dominant form, and they sort of range from there's no time for art, right? That climate is such an emergency. I have this kind of little signature moment where the extremely accomplished poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs writes this prose essay after the Maui fires. And she says, I wanted to write a poem about how the extreme heat of the ocean is breaking my heart. But who needs a metaphor in times as hot and blunt as ours? Let's make it plain. And this drive to the plain and to cut out metaphor, that seems to be a way that many artists and critics and readers feel is the kind of predicament for art and the urgency of our situation. That's sort of one side, right? Like, there's no time for it. We got to cut out this like messy mediation and just get to the point, right? And that art is a luxury and so on, right? So that's sort of one position. And then a kind of related position is there's only time for art if it is not directly engaging with the problem, right? If instead it's reminding us that we have to be uninstrumental and we have to be humble and we have to be irresolute. I call this kind of the romantic indeterminacy sort of thing, but the idea that art is very, very removed removed from ordinary proceedings like engineering solutions or political problems. And it somehow is just like keeping open the part of our minds that isn't involved in those things. And so that we need to do that in some sort of spiritual way, but there's no kind of measurable sort of political or emotional effect, right? Um, and then, so this is just sort of moving along the spectrum. And then there's a kind of side of, no, art is communications and it's direct messaging. It actually, we do have time for it. In fact, we have a need for it. The people haven't responded to the facts of climate change. And so we need storytelling and we need messaging and we need really graphic depictions of what's going to happen. And so then we get the whole kind of cli-fi genre and it's like sadistic literalism. And it's kind of, it promises that the future is going to be hot and retaliative and rapey. And I've really come to think of cli-fi as a reactionary genre in its kind of certitude about how human beings commit violence, which is just actually the opposite of the record that we have, the historical record of mutual collaboration in crisis zones and so on. So all of those aesthetic frames, which I think of as a kind of spectrum of like art doesn't do anything, art shouldn't do anything, art can only be very literal. They're unsatisfying, and I'm trying to pose a counter of this more murky middle space where aesthetic representations teach us things, or they inspire actions, or they help us work through problems, and they do so with tenable meaning, not with indeterminacy. They do so with maybe some mobilizing good affects, not with so much fear and kind of brutal presumption. And also that they help us think about the past rather than think about the future in ways that orient us to causes and can cue us to more strategy and solutions.
Very interesting. There was a lot in it that I wanted to talk about with you. Yes, an upcoming book. I'm very much looking forward to that. I mean, what I encounter increasingly is a certain switch in futurity, one might say, within elements of the ecologically minded left. And it's first of all a recognition of a crushing defeat, I would say, and a certain pain in realizing this defeat. And this is, I would argue, completely understandable and also absolutely legitimate, specifically the pain and trying to cope with this pain. But in some cases, this is accompanied by a kind of fatalism that not only posits that the fight against climate change has been lost, but that it is actually too late and basically hopeless to fight for systemic change. And there's a prominent German activist, for example, who, after going through a personal but very public crisis, is now advocating for a form of left prepping as the only form of sensible left ecological action that is supposedly left. And on the aesthetic level, this is accompanied by narratives of apocalyptic end times and the last fight against right-wing hordes that need to be fought off from a Berlin gay club bunker and stuff like that. So it has these images, an aesthetic element to it, which is, I would argue, not at all counter-aesthetic, but much more, as you just pointed towards, actually basically reactionary aesthetics, I would argue. Yeah. What do you make of this fatalism on the left and its kind of accompanying shift in futurity?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that you're absolutely right that there's a prominent fatalism. It presents itself as wise. It presents itself as savvy. But this kind of conviction about immutability, that nothing can change and that things have always been this way, is a very old left position, but it is particularly insidious and particularly popular in left theoretical circles now. And I think that it's just understandable, but symptomatic and like not sufficient to the job of theory and not sufficient to, again, not honoring the historical record. I mean, I'm very moved by the kind of like incredible examples we see everywhere in our contemporary life of the mutual aid work that people do in low-lying zones after hurricanes and so on. And, not just in Bangladesh, but in North Carolina. And Rebecca Solnit has a wonderful book about this, but I also think that in some most theoretical sense that, as it were, left theory, or certainly a Marxist account of human history, is that it is about struggle. And that if you think that people are not always trying to get free and are not always trying to cooperate with each other and improve their situation, that's a kind of romantic resignation that, again, has long legacies and long aesthetic legacies, but that doesn't really suffice as strategic thinking at this moment. So I'm kind of, I find myself opposed to that tendency, not in favor of some, insipid hope or something like that, but in favor of the discipline of the kind of work that people are doing in so many different locations already, and in favor of the discipline of trying to think dialectically and against our presuppositions about, like, what is the role of the state in our situation, say, or what kinds of levers of power are available to us. And I do think that the whole romantic resignation paradigm goes again with that sort of beautiful soul aesthetic of recession and staying with the trouble. Recession meaning receding, kind of reclining, right? That fantasies of agency got us into this problem, and so we should abdicate our agency and just sort of go among the mushrooms. And so like these, kind of images of, again, renunciation, resignation, abdication, that are symptomatically understandable, but they fail the bar of strategy, and they're not really accurate to how real activists work now.
And what then are examples of climate counter-aesthetics that approach these questions differently, especially given our times, which are undoubtedly catastrophic and in which the kind of closing down of worlds is so pervasive, the closing down of minds as well. And I mean, as you just pointed towards, it can't be about simply telling positive or optimistic stories in a somewhat naive or uncritically utopian sense. So what could a climate counter-aesthetics look like that does not engage in apocalyptic fatalism on the one hand, nor in naive utopianism? Because I'm quite convinced that there is room for, let's say, radical imaginaries that operate differently. For example, it's certainly not too late to start building a democratic planned economy in which decisions about whether or not we invest in fossil fuels can be made on a democratic level or democratic grounds, as opposed to market forces and capital interests. So there are good arguments to be made or to be brought forward for that, but that does not yet address the aesthetic layer to the whole thing. So I would be interested in how can we approach this aesthetic layer then?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's take your example of democratic planning, right, and centralization. And obviously there's a lot of disagreement about this on the left, but I agree with you. It is not too late to have more democratic, more collaborative, collective planning and collective sovereignty, and to make decisions about our resources and to commit to, low carbon social reproduction as like the site of value in our lives, right? So what are the genres that help us think about collective action, or that help us think about planning, or that make planning sexy, for instance, is one question that I ask, right? So I have a whole kind of section of the project that is about heist cinema and the historical heyday of heist cinema in the 21st century, and the aestheticization of planning and of collective endeavor, and what it means to undertake a reallocation of resources against quite behemoths like, casino capitalism. Or I'm extremely interested in, I totally love the Steven Soderbergh film Logan Lucky, which is about heisting NASCAR, right? So that gets the enemy right, It's petroculture. And then it assembles this like incredible ragtag ensemble of all different kinds of people, including like the whole population of the penitentiary in Monroe County. Like it, makes this team, right? And that heist as a genre is about confederating a team, doing the planning, aestheticizing the planning, and having like a happy ending often. And so that there's this way that you might think about and form like that is imparting concrete lessons, right? There's content there. It's not indeterminate, poetic, like irresolution, right? The content is about the pleasure and the winnability of collective work, right? So I think that that's like a valuable form that would be counter to, say, apocalyptic cinema that's like the destruction of the world and the blowing up of the Golden Gate Bridge. I'm also really interested in countering a lot of the emphasis on the bad future with kind of creative explorations of the past. Narratives, so that can happen in many art forms, but I'm especially interested in them in novels and in the genre of the historical novel. Narratives orient us to causes, right? If I say the queen died, and this is an old like E.M. Forster, insight. If I say the queen died, that's an event. But if I say the queen died of boredom, or the queen died of matricide, that's a narrative. Cause is integral for narrative. And a lot of the climate arts that are about effects are sort of unnarrative, right? They conjure these atmospheres. They're sort of like static, not a lot happens. It's like this is, the portrait or the sketch of the terrible life that we're living in, or the disconnected life that we're living in, the ambient climate anxiety, even that we're living in. But what about aesthetic forms that attune us to causes and that help us think about causes? I'm very interested in historical novels about the origins of profound petroculture, novels about the highway system, and novels about the association in American mythology of cars with freedom and with sexual pleasure. So I have articles that I've already published, in fact, about novels by Susan Choi and Lydia Millett and Helena Viramontes, and where the force of the narrative is to focus us on the causes of our current crisis in ways that attune us to some solutions, right? Car culture is actually remediable. It's actually changeable. Again, like, collective action and logistics and planning about our democratically deliberated values can give us public transit, can give us free buses, as, Zoran Mamdani's campaign has promised, right? Can attune us to the solutions, because there's a lot of, in this left romantic resignation, immutability paradigm, there's a lot of, it's bad to think about solutions and nothing is sort of remediable, right? But there are some very simple causes of our problems. And one can nationalize the oil companies, and one can have better transit policy, and one can imagine different kinds of freedom. And so I'm just interested in the thinking. Again, it is about kind of, content and ideas and the ways that the genres, cultivate our thinking. That if we focus on the simple causes of our problems, we can have some fairly simple legislative solutions. It doesn't need to be this like pseudo-indigenous complexity of like, I and the mushroom and the plant, or, can never find the bounds of our agency and we must be humble and entangled. It's not that hard to say, like, no more billionaires, no more private planes, yes, public transit. These enormous tank cars are totally dangerous to all pedestrians and babies in a stroller, and let's not have them. That's not a hard thing to say. It's a hard thing to operationalize, so you have to have the collective will, but
yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the democratic planning heist movie, I have to say. I already see it in the making in my mind. And also I had to think of Francis Bufford's Red Plenty. I'm not sure if you know the book. It's a book about democratic planning, actually, a novel, which is really interesting and basically tries to... Yeah, no, it's really good. It's really good. I can totally recommend it. I would maybe like to get a little bit deeper into this narrative aspect of it because, I mean, on the one hand, there is what you just sketched. For example, genres like the heist movie and a certain form of utilizing narrative in order to engage in for example, making democratic planning sexy, as you said, which is absolutely a great idea, I have to say. But then there's also a different level to it. And I think if we look at the role that the idea of the market plays for liberal and neoliberal imaginaries, then a good chunk of it is basically a form of Realfiktion, or what some might maybe call a hyperstition or a self-fulfilling prophecy of some sort. Not necessarily in the sense that markets then actually work in the way that the story tells us, but the narrative aspect to it is an important aspect through which the whole thing is being brought about and made operationable, let's say.
Right.
It provides a certain coherence through narrative that I believe to be of great importance, since it is able to pull together very disparate elements and make them interact with each other in a somewhat coherent way, let's say. Now, what could be this narrative element of climate counter-aesthetics that could be able to provide a similar cohesive function while overcoming markets as the central organizational Realfiktion, let's say?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. And part of it is tricky. So the coordinating function that you're talking about and the ability to sort of like have an aesthetic form that lets us think about what's the logic of society?
Mm.
What is the ideology of society? That's the, in my opinion, traditional historical job of the novel as the art form unique to capitalism. And so the novel is particularly good at, balancing inner and outer, doing kind of psychic depth and focalizing characters while also doing social breadth and having kind of ensemble cast or lots and lots of different social contexts and the description of environment, the evocation of context. And because novels often work through a narrative perspective that is super to our phenomenal existence, right?
Mm.
Omniscience or the kind of traditional trappings of, say, realist fiction. I think that that form is incredibly important. So, who is writing really interesting climate realism, say, not Cli-Fi's futurism, but the kind of accounts of society and the exploration and mediation of its determining logics today? The person who I've written about the most, or the novels I've written about the most in this regard, on the kind of realism and indeed utopian aspect, are Kim Stanley Robinson's. New York 2140 and the Ministry for the Future, both of which are set in a near future and a nearer future than climate fiction usually is, especially Ministry for the Future. And both of which are extremely analytic and descriptive and theoretical about the role of the market. And both of which also have a fairly dialectical kind of flexibility about we have to have all the tools of use to us. And there may even be ways that the market itself has to be put to work, right? So that you need black ops terrorist operations against billionaire
Mhm.
private planes, but you also need carbon tax schemes, right? Or you might need a kind of alternate currency floated by a state which supports divestment or which support, so that he's really eclectic in his willingness to consider all available political and technological means. And I do think that that is a kind of capacious thinking that isn't just, say, apologetics, but that is just simply tactical, right?
Mm.
What are in our different situations that we're in? What is the power that's available to us? What are the tools that are available to us? And how can that be seized and how can that be utilized? Think about something like the, Inflation Reduction Act here. That was of great interest to a lot of observers of, political economy. because it was an effort to expand state industrial capacity in green directions. There are contradictions there about the ongoing propping up of markets or about the ongoing commitment to market extraction of value as what should be our priorities. But there is also real effects there, in these very small projects that all add up enormously, about installing heat pumps in, people's homes, or about investing in electric vehicles for the delivery of municipal services and federal services like the USPS, or the expansion of the state was pretty radical at that point. After, people were like, "Oh, is this the end of neoliberalism?" The IRA, even in its terribly compromised and attenuated form compared to, the visions of a Green New Deal, right? But so we just kind of do need to use all the tools, and if we think about all the tools, again, I think this is like just dialectical strategy and it's organizing strategy and so on. Then it's not. The question you're confronted with isn't, are my actions eradicating the market, right? But are my actions contributing to expanding that array of tools, that repertoire of strategies? And are they also ameliorating and remediating the terrors that are immediately present to us?
Yeah, I totally get that. Also, to be open to a certain spectrum of tools, let's say. But then nonetheless, I would argue the core of it would be, if not to overcome the market in total, which might be an option and I'm okay with in certain respects, the goal would nonetheless be to provide an alternative narrative when it comes to what social technology is the driver of, or the core element of societal organization, let's say, because that is right now like the problem that we have unpersonal market forces, which are quote unquote acting behind our backs and which are used as a kind of power tool, let's say, in order to reproduce the status quo. And if we wanted to develop alternative meta-narratives as social technologies, let's say, then we would have to come up with a different element to what the market is currently doing in that respect. So there would still be a hole or a gap to close in that regard if we want to overcome markets as the prime mechanism of societal organization, which arguably should be done, I think.
I agree. And I think this is a hard aesthetic question. So I really do take heart that a lot of actually practical, say, political scientists and communication studies people who are invested in like climate messaging are thinking about these genres, right? So the sociologist Dan Aldana Cohen has this kind of notion of policy you can touch, or the Climate and Community Institute is this wonderful think tank that is really committed to positive visions of what there is to be won, right? So they propose things like low carbon leisure, and which is about swimming pools and ways to cool off in collective spaces, right? Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's original campaign materials included this hand illustrated graphic video of like a message from the future, right? And what there is that's good that can come to us in the future, right? So what are these genres that concretely realize life that is organized around care, right? Because care is low carbon work, relatively impervious to automation, so teaching, nursing, artistry, cultivation, right? Making human beings and making human society as the just goal in and of itself of our activities, of our collaborations, of our use of our resources. There's been, the Green New Deal thought really hard about prioritizing free college and free healthcare, because these industries that are the pursuit of human cultivation are what the horizon is that is different from the pursuit of profit. right? It is human flourishing for its own sake. It is human creativity for its own sake. Unfortunately, we are in a extremely scary moment, where our AI grifter bubble is explicitly, about the kind of fantasy that we can just sort of do away with people, and especially that we should do away with the most fun parts of being a human being and the most trans-historical parts of being a human being, which are creativity and playing and making art and things that, again, are not that energy intensive and are not profit oriented and that should be the basis of our lives, So I do think that there's some really interesting kind of think tanky, journalistic policy, calm studies like realization that we need positive visions of what can be won. A Planet to Win is a good, like, interesting example, a co-authored book. And Naomi Klein is very good about this. Astor Taylor and Naomi Klein recently had this kind of long piece about what's the future, that bad future that's coming, and it's like, but we need a good future, right? And again, just to take the Zoran example because it's so fresh in our mind, like, he's a lot of style and form, right? He's an excellent communicator. He's so cute. He's great at TikTok or whatever, but he's also so much substance, right? And the substance is like, your life can be better, right? Affordability, fun, civic services, right? And so the content of those visions and the content of those messages, I think, are starting to develop in really, exciting ways, but not in the aesthetic realm yet. And so these are aesthetic insofar as they are pictures and insofar as they are projections and they are syntheses. So these, kind of non-artists are using artistic tools and let's think about the, genres that they're in, right? The modes that they're in. They're kind of social realists, they're kind of collective representation, they're kind of, but what is the art that is adequate to helping to propagate those values? I think as I kind of, diagnose an immediacy, like, we're in a bad way with a lot of our art. And so there's not tons to be excited about on that front. There are people who residually are invested in social realism as a aesthetic mode. That's also, I think, something that Kim Stanley Robinson has going for him. But I talk about in the conclusion to Immediacy, contemporary Black fiction novels like Colson Whitehead, for instance, Brandon Taylor. There are residual kind of ensemble, highly plotted dramas that haven't been taken over by private equity and are still invested in writing. So I describe Succession there. I don't know if you've watched the show Somebody Somewhere. That's also in that model where they do invest in writing. But it's about this just community of friends who are, straight and queer and trans in Manhattan, Kansas. And one of the centers of the show is a agricultural professor, like at like the University of Kansas in Manhattan. And one of them is like a daughter of farmers, but they've kind of sold off the farm. And they're just like trying to find a way in kind of, semi-rural America to take care of one another and to have some pleasures every day. And music is a big part of the way that they do it. And so it's just this kind of nice ensemble-y, depiction of just abiding in a life that is friendship-based and has, places where they can go to have community happen, like the church basement or the neighborhood bar or the neighborhood cafe, right? This kind of third place element of missing social infrastructure. So like representations like that, I think, do have things to give us, but I don't think we have a whole movement of them right now. All right, that was a long answer.
And I mean, would you say that it's at some point needs some form of meta-narrative as well? I mean, you already touched upon elements of that in the form of public luxury, for example. This is something that is being discussed in Germany, for example, quite a lot. And I really like the label public luxury because it immediately starts with an offer, with an attractive offer instead of everything is going to shit. Right. So this totally makes sense to me, but it's still not yet at the level of the, let's say, societal meta-narrative, so to speak. Would you say that this is even something that we should and can think about in these very pragmatic terms? And then if yes, how can it be brought about that this construction of a collective meta-narrative is also somewhat democratized in the sense of not like some avant-garde, whatever, either artists or politicians or a group of artists and politicians coming together to build some form of meta-narrative, but instead that we have a form of collective development towards this shared goal, this shared futurity, which we then would also, of course, have to collectively bring about. So how do you think about this element of a, let's say meta-narrative, and lack of a better word, or maybe you have a better word?
Yeah, no, I absolutely love this question. I think it's essential, but I might differ from you a little bit in some of my approach to it. So we need commanding visions and inspiring images and a framework for our lives. And again, a story of what we can win, so the offer or the what you get, what are you going to get, right? The gain frame, one of my friends calls it. She's a consultant, but what do you win, right? Not just what we have to sacrifice, but there's so much that we could have, communally together, right? We do have enough. It's just not allocated the right way and with the right priorities, right? So where I might differ with you is that I actually do think it is the job of intellectuals to articulate these visions and to circulate and promulgate them, and to use our skills of metaphor, and to use our skills of dramatization, and to use our skills of humor to bring people into the vision. And I don't think that it has to be I don't think we have the infrastructure to completely democratically and certainly not anarchically generate commanding ideas that lead the way. But I do think that ideas have a role. An aestheticized representation of ideas have a huge role in galvanizing movements, and that it is actually something that critics can be experts in, and something that theorists can be experts in, is tendering compelling ideas. It happens to be the case that, a lot of people would say that's elitist, and I just simply disagree. There are people who have had the opportunity and the education and the resources to cultivate expertise in thinking about how we should live, philosophers, sociologists, and so on. And we should draw upon their expertise. And also, it's a kind of way of thinking about the interplay of critics and philosophers with artists, that sometimes or traditionally you might say, we have the idea that intellectuals respond to the artworks, right? That they come after, even if the critic is the parasite, right? But there is just as much of a kind of counter tradition of thinking that critics generate the artworks, right? That we predict or solicit or sort of prepare the way for the better artworks to come into being. And I really found that to be sort of practically the case, that having written Immediacy, that artists are so hungry for a way to do something that's not these hegemonic imperatives of what our cultural style is. And I simply don't have enough physical time to go to all the art schools that want me to come to them and teach their MFAs and stuff like that. It's incredible that there's this hunger, but it is the job of the critic to help better work get made. Right? And I think it is the job of the intellectuals at large to put forth these syntheses that the people can attach to and be galvanized by and organize around and implement. And that, of course, will involve democratic contestation of how you implement them and democratic reformulation. But I don't think that we can, practically speaking, just wait for an entire counter-hegemonic value matrix to spontaneously arise from the working masses.
Yeah, I mean, also there are other ways to conceptualize this, I guess. I have to think of Rodrigo Nunes's book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, for example, in which he uses this notion of a organizational ecology in which there are indeed also vertical elements next to horizontal elements, because both of them are needed with regard to certain things and certain situations. Absolutely. And so on. So there is a way to say not either or, but as well as, let's say. And so there might be a way to use this, such a framework, to also think about the way in which these imaginaries are being brought about and disseminated, and at some point still being co-produced by horizontal as well as vertical elements, so to speak. It sounds a little bit abstract, but yeah, I guess there are ways to think this differently. But would you then say that, I mean, this is maybe a stupid question in some way, but do you think there is a need for some labeling going on? Because, I mean, you also mentioned your friend who talked about the gain frame, which is a really nice way of putting it. And I totally see the gain in using the gain frame. For example, I would argue that security and freedom are two very, very important elements that should be brought forward when it comes to this narrative. But then I'm asking myself, do you think it's helpful or maybe even counterproductive to try to somewhat label the broader how do you say, the broader project, in lack of a better word? I mean, I mean, some use socialism, some use communism, and some use other words, and these, of course, have different traditions and so on. But would you say there is worth in then also using this labeling aspect to it?
Absolutely, 100%. I think it's just a sheer matter of tactical efficacy. And it's also one of the things that people who are experts in aesthetics should be able to understand about politics, that slogans are essential, that little pieces of language cassette people, they accrete followers, that concrete images are the basis for commonly held meaning and commonly articulated values, that repetition is a crucial technology of binding together collectives. So we need sexy memes and cool taglines and visionary slogans, and propagating those, I do think, is, again, the job of the people who should be wordsmiths or expert storytellers or idea generators. I think that it's especially useful for there to be some that are at the strata or tier below ism, right? So socialism, communism, they have their traditions, right? But they have so much baggage, and they have the intimidating scale that, oh, we're just like doing revolution, or we're doing totally everything is, different. And that's a hard thing to organize around, actually. I think people will tell you, right? And that, but public luxury, to take your, one example, that's such a great two-word phrase that it can encompass so much and can invite, democratic deliberation of like, what would it mean to you for us to be in luxury together, or for our society to have more freedom or more time? Freedom and security, I think those are absolutely crucial. I don't know if you know the work of the philosopher Femi Taiwo, but he has a whole kind of article about reclaiming security. Like, yes, it's the bad, like 9/11 buzzword or whatever, and there's the security apparatus, and Homeland Security is our like incredible Gestapo right now, obviously. But security, nonetheless, actually is the noun for something that we want for everybody, right? Bodily integrity, protection from the elements, protection from violence, right? At basic needs, So I just 100% think that we need to be very, very overt about generating values and generating them in aesthetically cathartic forms. And, is a little bit of an obstacle in the like intellectuals, might think that this is elitist of them to do, but there's also the obstacle that a lot of our trendy intellectual formations are about critiquing values and taking things apart and insisting that, like, say, a big idea is a generalization, or that it obscures particulars and, complexities, and that we like to kind of undo things, right? We have a kind of dissolutionist approach to what criticism is, but we need constructive criticism. We need constructive theory. The book before Immediacy is about this problem, the order of forms, but Femi is an excellent thinker of this. There are other pro-values, I think, intellectuals who believe that this actually is our job, to synthesize and to formulate. And of course, there's all kinds of really cool work in like political rhetoric and communications and linguistics about how like you just got to have these names for your things. Like you've got to have the frame, right? George Lakoff, for instance, right? So yes, and I just want to stress that these are this is the kind of remit or the domain of expertise of like poets, and artists and filmmakers and storytellers, the people on the aesthetic side of our science and industries do have these skills. So they should put them to work.
Fantastic. Then I have a proposition to make, I guess, because the edited volume on democratic planning that I co-edited together with Christoph Sorg is titled Creative Construction, Democratic Planning in the 21st Century and Beyond. And I always had the feeling that there is maybe more to this notion of creative construction, which obviously is also a counter to creative destruction. And when reading your texts, I had the impression that creative construction is at least an element of what you are arguing for, that we need to engage in forms of creative construction in the broadest sense. And at least for me, this would include everything from like the arts in a more narrow sense, but also new institutional design or new institutional mechanisms, or the climate counter-aesthetics that you mentioned, or the new narratives on a societal level that we talked about.
Absolutely.
I think this maybe I will just propose this as one of these frames or labels that creative construction might be something that we should be out for.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, I talk about this in both the Order of Forms and in the end of Immediacy, like constructivist and categorical theorizing, kind of constructivist approach to political formalization, to organization. We do actually have a bunch of political forms available to us that can be, jiggered and slightly reformed. We don't have to have endless search for the new, right? And I'm really taken by dynamic and capacious and dialectical efforts to rethink the state. There was just an issue of Boston Review called like, what is the state for? Again, Femi was there. Like, I think that creative construction is absolutely a fabulous frame for how we should unite left intellectuals in like our job is also putting things together. It's also composition. It's also making, it's not just burning it all down. And that's a job that unites. I mean, just think about how Marx describes what human being is. I was appealing earlier to like this idea that we are creative and we play and we make things, right? But making is so pleasing and is so integral to our function as an animal, and we should commit to that all the way up and all the way down. Yeah, what can we construct that's better? I love that frame.
Fantastic. This is something which is really slightly in a different area than what we talked about before, but I would nonetheless like to ask you about it, because I saw you criticizing overly psychoanalytical takes on climate inaction, and this is something I see popping up basically everywhere, I have to say. And could you maybe just in a broad sketch give us your take on this, because I see it all the time everywhere. And now maybe this has to do with this realization that a certain cycle has come to its end with a crushing defeat. And now people are searching for answers in the realm of psychoanalysis. So I would be interested in your take on this.
Yeah. So this is very related to the opening question about fatalism and nihilism and immutability. I think it's not overly psychoanalytical. It is wrong psychoanalytically, but it is nonetheless overly popular in sort of not really psychoanalytic circles. Like people who I think literally haven't even read Freud on the death drive are obsessed with saying that climate change is understandable as death drive, that humanity has a death drive, that we are, as a species, stupidly impelled towards destruction and towards annihilating and extinction, right? And that's the only way to explain climate inaction. And this is extremely prevalent among all kinds of activists, journalists, and intellectuals who, again, I think really have not read the Freud, but who, feel that it is somehow deep philosophically, and people who are really employed as professors who are promulgating this thesis. And I have an article in the psychoanalytic magazine Parapraxis where I try to, go through a bunch of examples of people saying this, but it is very related to this immutability paradigm, the idea that humanity itself is like a virus, or humanity itself is like, a parasite that is destroying the earth, and that the earth will be better without us when we fulfill our program of deliberately engineered self-extinction. And I just think this is completely wrong psychoanalytically, and it is completely obfuscatory politically. It does not clarify anything, right? We have a collective sovereignty problem. We do not have a collective will towards our extinction. We have a small number of oligarchs and, petro czars who are forcing this on us, and doing so through structures of minoritarian and authoritarian rule that can be democratically overturned, and doing so through specific historical forms like the corporation that can be reworked. We can nationalize these companies and seize their assets and stop doing this, right? That small group of people, what their libido is a different question than the masses of humanity simply want this. And again, I just think that is totally, it totally obscures like where the power is in the situation. And it's a way of sounding righteous and sounding, cynical, that is just like, well, we're just compelled to do this, right? It is psychoanalytically wrong, in addition to being politically ideological, really politically distorting, because the account of death drive in Freud is of creative construction. It is of sublimation. Death drive is not a program to efficiently die, right? It is not going for your goal and getting it, right? Otherwise, why are we failing to die all day, every day, right? Like it is the, repetitive, detour from death. It is the putting into, different forms and different relations and different patterns of these will to make things, of radical constitution, of radical construction and creation. And that's why it is always, kind of attended for Freud by questions of art, really, and why so many interesting artists have taken it up. But, when Freud discovers the death drive, he doesn't say like, oh, World War I was all these people killing everybody, and that's a death drive. That's exactly the opposite of what occasions his discovery, right? It's these soldiers who've been through trauma and hell who nonetheless want to be alive, right? And are trying to work through their difficult experiences, and are sort of doing so with craft and art and sculpture, and are doing so in their dreams and in their symptoms. It's the why are we not dead? The question he's interested in is like, what do we make, right? It's not why do we kill each other? And that's just like not what the psychoanalytic account of death drive is. So I just want academics to stop saying, and journalists to stop saying, and activists to stop saying like, oh, we have a death drive and that's why we're doing nothing about climate. It's like we have a tactical problem about how we get our authoritarian petrocrat minority to be overturned.
And we already learned that there will need to be some form of attractive climate counter-aesthetics to it. Before we get to the last question that I ask all of my guests, what would be needed in order to bring about this climate counter-aesthetics in a much more broadened sense? What is needed in a physical, material sense, maybe, but also in a, let's say, spiritual sense, hopefully not sounding too cliche about it. So what would we need in order to bring about climate counter-aesthetics?
Yeah. So we need faith that artworks and creative constructions and creative representations do help us live better. So this there's no time for art position, which I think is very, prevalent, and even as a way of like interpreting the, throw the stop oil throwing paint on paintings and stuff like that, right? Stamping out representation, cutting this out so that we can get to the quick of the matter. That whole paradigm, as I diagnose in Immediacy, is overdetermined by circulation forward capitalism, is not actually strategic, right? We have to have a tolerance for representation. We have to have commitments to mediation. We have to have a constructive ethos about those things rather than a, chrysogenic like desire to cut them out. So that is a kind of value reframing that I am prescriptive about, right? We have to have conditions that make it possible for people to engage in creative construction. And so to me, that's very social welfare state 101 type stuff about like, we need education. It needs to be accessible. We need to know the history of ideas and the history of society and the history of art so that we can make new, better stuff. The just absolute assault on education, on the freedom to learn that our authoritarians are undertaking, really belies how crucial that is as just fundamental infrastructure for social well-being and for social transformation. I don't think we get a lot of better art. We don't get more climate counter-aesthetics without better conditions for people to generate culture. That is a kind of, vicious cycle that I'm interested in. How do artworks capacitate struggle? And how do we only get good artworks when we have a better society? So it's a hard problem. But what I can do as teacher and as writer and as critic is not shy away from engaging in some of that kind of evaluative, exhortative, predictive, instructive work, synthetic work. It would be good if we had art that did X, is like an appropriate thing for critics to say.
Okay, and I already announced it. There's a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Oh. I do think we will win. There's no clear time horizon for it. Things are extremely grim in a number of the, siloed, competitive, authoritarian poles of the world, right? Ours foremost right now, I think, in the US. But there are more of us than there are of them. And there is, I think, an indomitable spirit of creativity and coalition and cooperation. And people want more. They want to be in coalition and be in community and live better lives. And so that is like a thing that I see in my present all the time, because I do labor organizing and organizing of cultural workers and of higher education workers and also primary education workers. And I just see people trying to make things better and being incredibly dynamic and compelling in their movement building. So I try to take hope for the future from the struggle and even the wins that people are having around me right now.
Wonderful.
Also, I hope we can get all the carbon out of the atmosphere and make more bubbly water.
Anna, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thank you for having me here. It's been so wonderful to talk with you. Creative construction.
Yay! Woohoo! That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.